May 1945. The Third Reich officially surrendered. The SS had spent years systematically terrorizing civilians across the European continent. Now, the German war machine collapsed. The tables turned instantly. Why were these men terrified? They belonged to the elite. But status offered no protection now. Captured SS soldiers were not treated like regular prisoners of war. Allied troops did not see them as simple combatants. They were viewed as criminals in uniform. Soldiers hunted them through ruined cities and dense forests. In many cases, there was no trial. Captors shot them on the spot. The footage shows piles of discarded black tunics in the mud. Soldiers ripped off their insignia. They tried to blend into the masses of regular infantry. It did not work. Allied guards forced them to strip to the waist to check for blood group tattoos under the left arm. This mark was a death sentence. The sound of barked orders and sporadic gunfire filled the camps. It wasn't just revenge. It was a systematic purge of the most fanatical elements of the regime. What followed became one of the most unforgiving reckonings of the entire post-war period. But this was only the beginning. At first glance, a chaotic surrender. But in reality, a calculated execution of justice. Allied units liberated the concentration camps and saw the evidence with their own eyes. The smell of decay was everywhere. The sight of the victims removed any remaining mercy. The camera records, SS guards forced to bury the dead by hand. The local population watched in silence. No one moved to help. No one dared to speak. Events accelerated. Thousands were processed in makeshift enclosures. The standard rules of the Geneva Convention often ceased to exist for those wearing the double lightning bolts. The reckoning was absolute. 1923. Germany had no anchor. The economy collapsed. People waited in lines for hours to buy a single loaf of bread. Prices doubled every 24 hours. Children watched their parents sell chairs and tables just to buy milk. Veterans returned from the Great War to find empty factories and no work. Young men grew up believing their nation had been humiliated by the world. This atmosphere created a vacuum. Dangerous ideas filled that space. The Nazi Party utilized the collective anger. They offered two things: someone to blame and someone strong to follow. Followers joined by the thousands. Within this movement, a small group formed in 1925. At first glance, a few bodyguards, but in reality, the seed of a shadow empire. The original team consisted of only a few men. Figures like Emil Maurice and Julius Schreck stood near Hitler. They acted as drivers, they carried bags, they stood at the back of beer halls. They looked more like hired help than a military force. But as the years passed, the structure changed. Events accelerated in 1929. Heinrich Himmler took control. He immediately began a total reorganization. Himmler did not want a simple security detail. He wanted a force to reshape the nation from the inside out. He implemented rigid discipline. He introduced racial indoctrination. He demanded absolute personal loyalty to the leader. There was no turning back. By 1933, the numbers tell the story. The group grew to over 52,000 members. It no longer resembled the small team from 8 years prior. The footage from this era shows a transformation. Men stand in perfect rows. Uniforms are sharp. Boots are polished to a mirror finish. Himmler pushed a specific narrative. He told his men they were the elite. He convinced them they were superior to all other Germans. He wanted them to be cleaner and purer. To achieve this, he built specialized training centers. The camera records the gates of the Junkerschule at Bad Tölz in Braunschweig. These were not traditional schools. They were laboratories for a new kind of soldier. Cadets woke up at dawn. They studied racial charts. They practiced combat for 12 hours a day. The sound of hobnailed boots hitting gravel became the new rhythm of Germany. The small guard was gone. An army of shadows had taken its place. 1933. The training began. SS instructors taught young recruits that hesitation was a terminal weakness. Recruits endured 18-hour drills, 50-mile marches, and relentless ideological sessions. These sessions erased empathy. They replaced personal identity with loyalty to Adolf Hitler alone. A clear divide formed. The average Wehrmacht soldier learned strategy, marksmanship, and survival. But the SS recruit learned to kill doubt. They staged mock raids on civilian homes. They practiced clearing entire villages. They forced actors to kneel at gunpoint. Heinrich Himmler watched these drills. He believed sympathy was a flaw. A man who felt pity could not finish the job. This mindset transformed the SS into a fanatical cult. The military became a machine for execution. September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The world expected a standard war of tanks and infantry, but a shadow followed the tanks. Behind the front lines, specialized SS units prepared for special actions. This was a code for liquidation. Einsatzgruppe 4 moved into position. Josef Albert Meisinger led the unit. They entered Warsaw and Radom. They didn't carry maps of enemy bunkers. They carried lists of names. These were targets for immediate execution. Teachers, priests, and politicians were dragged from their beds. The pattern repeated in Poznan. It spread to Piotrków and Kielce. The sound of Mauser bolts racking echoed through the streets. In 21 days, these units murdered over 20,000 civilians. None of these people died in combat. They died in small courtyards and open fields. The scale of the killing increased. The SS expanded its reach across occupied territory, but the roots of this violence started much earlier. By 1929, the organization had already begun its rise to total power. The transformation was complete. June 1941. The German army crossed the Soviet border and the scale of mass execution exploded. This was not a side effect of war. It was a calculated industry of death. 4 specialized units led the slaughter. Einsatzgruppe A operated in the Baltic states. Under the command of Franz Stahlecker, the unit moved through Lithuania and Latvia. They left a trail of mass graves stretching from Kaunas to Riga. In Ukraine, Einsatzgruppe C followed a similar pattern. Commander Otto Rasch directed operations in Zhytomyr, Poltava, and Dnipropetrovsk. The result was the same: rows of trenches filled with bodies. But the killing did not stop there. In Belarus, Einsatzgruppe B took control. Arthur Neba led his men through Grodno, Vitebsk, and Mogilev. They turned forests into execution grounds. By early 1942, Einsatzgruppe A alone reported 249,000 deaths. When combined with the other 3 groups, the toll surpassed 700,000 in just a few months. How did so few men kill so many? It was a matter of logistics. The SS viewed murder as a bureaucratic task. Every action was planned, written down, and tracked in daily reports. There was no chaos. Some units were assigned to round up civilians. Others manned the firing lines. A third group cataloged the clothing and jewelry of the dead. It was a factory assembly line. The methods were brutal. In the forests outside Minsk, soldiers lined victims up at the edge of deep trenches. In Odessa, the SS carried out massive reprisals following attacks on German troops. They did not look for the culprits. They simply cleared entire city blocks. In Lithuania, the SS relied on local collaborators. Together, they destroyed whole neighborhoods in hours. Some towns lost their entire population in a single day. The survivors had nowhere to hide. But the SS changed its tactics in Western Europe. In France, the focus shifted to police work and deportation. The SS collaborated with the Gestapo to hunt down resistance members and Jewish families. In July 1942, the Vel d'Hiv roundup occurred in Paris. Police pulled 13,000 people from their homes in a single night. They were moved to stadiums, then to camps, and finally to the east. In Lyon, the violence became more personal. The machine was moving faster. There was no way to stop it. September 1943. This was the moment Italy changed sides. The SS responded with immediate and systematic violence. They stopped treating Italians as allies and began viewing them as targets. Security commanders like Klaus Barbie coordinated with police units to dismantle underground resistance networks. They interrogated suspects. They executed informants. They wiped out entire cells of the movement. In Denmark and the Netherlands, the tactics were different. SS police units operated under the cover of darkness. They arrived in trucks. They kicked down doors. They seized entire families while the neighborhood slept. By sunrise, the streets were silent. The houses stood empty. These were not arrests. These were disappearances. How did the SS maintain control over such a large territory? At first glance, through military power, but in reality, through calculated terror. March 24, 1944. The Ardeatine Caves in Rome became a slaughterhouse. SS units rounded up civilians. They marched them into the dark tunnels. 335 people were killed in just a few hours. This was a signal. It was a direct response to a partisan attack on German troops. One German life was worth 10 Italian lives. Events accelerated. In the village of Sant'Anna di Stazzema, the SS went further. They didn't just kill individuals, they destroyed the entire community. Soldiers moved from house to house with grenades and machine guns. Men, women, and children were lined up and shot. The village ceased to exist. But this was only the beginning. The footage from this era shows a chilling pattern. In the frame, smoke rising from scorched villages. The sound of heavy boots on cobblestones is audible. The worst evidence of SS brutality did not come from these mobile firing squads. It came from something more organized, something permanent. They built a vast system of camps across the European continent. They turned murder into an industrial process. 1933. The first camp opened at Dachau. It was small. It was designed to hold political rivals and strikers. But the scale changed quickly. Once the SS seized total control of the police and security forces, the barbed wire spread. By 1938, the map of Germany was dotted with sites like Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald. Thousands of prisoners filled the barracks. They lived under a regime of constant, calculated cruelty. These locations were not just prisons, they were testing grounds for the SS. Every act of violence here was a rehearsal for what came next. The system was ready to expand. 1939. The German army crossed the Polish border. Behind the front lines, the SS moved in. They did not just occupy territory, they began a massive construction project across Europe. These men had already learned how to run smaller prisons. Now they prepared to manage an industrial system of death. First came the ghettos. In cities like Krakow and Lublin, the SS cordoned off entire districts with barbed wire and brick walls. They forced hundreds of thousands of people into small rooms. Food supplies were cut off. Medicine was non-existent. It was the first stage of the plan, isolation. But the system expanded. The SS built labor camps near factories, coal mines, and stone quarries. They turned human beings into fuel for the war machine. By 1945, the numbers reached a breaking point. More than 44,000 camps and sub-camps stretched from France to the Soviet Union. Every site followed the same rule: total SS control. The footage from the era shows the faces of the men in charge. They were the commandants. They did not hide their actions. Rudolf Höss took command of Auschwitz. Under his watch, the gas chambers and crematoria never stopped. Smoke rose from the chimneys 24 hours a day. It was an assembly line of murder. At Buchenwald, Karl Otto Koch established a different method. He created a formal system of punishments. Guards used whips and clubs. Prisoners died slowly, some from starvation, others from sustained beatings during roll call. It was calculated cruelty. Max Pauli operated Neuengamme. He focused on the economy. He forced prisoners to work until their hearts stopped. There was no rest, no medical care. In Sachsenhausen, Hans Loritz used psychological warfare. He forced prisoners into endless marches on concrete tracks. They carried heavy packs until they collapsed. The goal was to break the human spirit before the body failed. But then, the policy shifted again. The SS built the extermination camps. These were not for labor, they were for liquidation. At Majdanek, officers Karl Otto Raschke and Anton Ternes combined three methods: mass shootings, starvation, and gas. They cleared entire transports in hours. Treblinka was even more efficient. Imfried Ebrel led the facility. In 1942 alone, 700,000 people were murdered there. It was a factory of bone and ash. Sobibor, Chelmno, and Belzec followed the same blueprint. The design was simple: kill as many people as fast as possible. Why did the guards do it? They were trained to obey. The SS schools taught them that hesitation was treason. Josef Kramer took over Bergen-Belsen. He watched as typhus and hunger destroyed thousands of people in the mud. He did nothing to stop it. Irma Gressa operated at Ravensbrück. She was known for her whip and her dogs. She targeted female prisoners with specific, targeted violence. At Sobibor, Karl Frenzel stood on the platform during selections. With a single movement of his hand, he decided who lived for an hour and who died immediately. At first glance, these were soldiers. But in reality, they were bureaucrats of a massacre. The system relied on their signatures and their silence. When the war ended, the evidence remained in the soil. The records were captured. The era of the camps was over. 77 days of agony. SS doctors performed medical experiments that resulted in permanent mutilation or slow death. The statistics from these sites defy comprehension. 1,100,000 people died in Auschwitz. 90,000 people were killed in Mauthausen through manual labor and physical torture. 65,000 lives ended in Stutthof due to mass shootings, typhus, and forced marches. Why did this happen? The answer is simple. The SS built a machine where human life carried zero value. The footage shows rows of barracks and piles of discarded belongings. Between 1943 and 1944, the German military began to lose. The SS responded by increasing the scale of the violence. As German forces retreated from Italy, combat units targeted the civilian population. One name stands out: Walter Raeder. He commanded the 16th SS Panzer Grenadier Division. His troops moved through the Apennine Mountains. They were angry and looking for a target. They accused local villagers of supporting partisan fighters. The massacre began on September 29, 1944. It lasted until October 5th. Soldiers moved from house to house. They dragged families into the streets. They fired at close range. In the Marzabado area, the ground was covered in brass shells. Over 770 people were executed in less than a week. The victims were not soldiers. They were women, infants, and the elderly. None of them were involved in the fighting. At first glance, a tactical retreat, but in reality, a war crime. Events accelerated across all fronts. The brutality was not limited to Italy. In the East, the situation reached the same level of calculated cruelty. There was no turning back. June 6, 1944, the Allies land in Normandy. In response, the SS receives orders to crush any sign of resistance with maximum brutality. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich begins its march. June 10, 1944. The village is Oradour-sur-Glane. SS troops surround the perimeter and force everyone into the center. They separate the men from the women and children. The men are taken to barns and garages. Machine guns open fire. The women and children are locked inside the village church. The soldiers block the exits and set the building on fire. The screams are audible from the street. 643 people die in a single afternoon. Today, the village remains untouched. Rusted cars and charred stone walls stand exactly where they fell. It is a memorial to total destruction. The pattern repeats in Belgium. December 17, 1944. The Battle of the Bulge is in full swing. Kampfgruppe Piper leads the spearhead. Joachim Piper gives the orders. Near the town of Malmedy, his unit captures a convoy of American soldiers. The SS drives the prisoners into a snowy field. There is no trial. There is no transport to a camp. The guards raise their weapons and open fire into the huddle of men. 84 Americans die in the snow. News of the Malmedy massacre spreads through the front lines. The effect is immediate. Allied troops realize that surrendering to the SS is a death sentence. The war changes. Allied soldiers stop viewing the SS as traditional combatants. To them, the black uniform signifies a murderer, not a soldier. When troops discover fresh crime scenes, the rules of war vanish. April 29, 1945. The 45th Infantry Division reaches Dachau. The footage shows the reality. Train cars sit on the tracks filled with thousands of emaciated corpses. These people were starved, beaten, and left to rot. The Americans move deeper into the camp. They find SS guards attempting to hide or drop their weapons. The soldiers do not wait for orders. They see the piles of bodies and react on instinct. Several guards are lined up against a wall and shot on sight. This was not an isolated incident. In Normandy, The cycle of vengeance claimed lives on all sides. In June 1944, Canadian prisoners were executed by the 12th SS. This triggered a chain of retaliations. The situation became chaotic. In the confusion of the front, friendly fire and revenge blurred the lines. British units reported instances where their own men were killed in the crossfire or by mistake. The battlefield had become a place where mercy was no longer a factor. Thus ended the era of traditional warfare. June 1944. Canadian soldiers discovered the bodies of their own men near Caen. The prisoners had been executed by the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. At the Abbaye d'Ardennes, 18 Canadians were lined up and shot in the back of the head. How did the troops react? It wasn't just anger, it was a shift in the rules of engagement. News of the massacre moved through the trenches in hours. Some Canadian units stopped taking SS prisoners entirely. They simply stopped and opened fire. On the Eastern Front, the war followed a different logic. Soviet soldiers moved through scorched earth and empty villages. They saw the work of the SS Dirlewanger Brigade. This was not a regular combat unit. It was a group of criminals and killers. 1943. The village of Katyn in Belarus. The SS surrounded the perimeter, locked the residents in barns, and set the wood on fire. Those who tried to escape were cut down by machine guns. 149 people died. Half of them were children. The Red Army saw millions of civilians murdered. They walked through towns where mass graves were the only landmarks. It was no longer a battle for territory. It was a war of annihilation. Command didn't need to give orders. The soldiers knew. SS insignia meant immediate death, but this was only the beginning of the end. By early 1945, the SS fought with a desperation that stunned veteran Allied troops. They were no longer fighting for victory. They were fighting to avoid the gallows. On the Oder River and in Pomerania, the Totenkopf and Viking divisions held their lines until the last man. The footage shows the results. Piles of empty shell casings, burned-out Tiger tanks. SS fighters refused to surrender even when surrounded by entire Soviet armies. They kept firing until their barrels warped from the heat. Events accelerated in Hungary. The siege of Budapest lasted from December 1944 to February 1945. Karl Pfeffer Wildenbruch commanded the defense. He turned the city into a meat grinder. The sound of constant artillery filled the air for 50 days. SS troops fought for every basement and every attic. More than 100,000 soldiers and civilians died in less than 3 months. The city was a graveyard of stone and glass. Supply lines collapsed. Food and ammunition ran out. Yet the SS units did not lower their weapons. They attempted a final suicidal breakout through the Russian lines. There was no turning back. Thus ended the siege.